a new report from the Business Council of Australia has urged people to stop blaming migration for the nation's housing crisis, saying that instead the problem is poor planning by successive governments over the issue. Now, BCA Chief Executive Jennifer Westacott threw her support behind Labor's proposed migration reforms, dismissing claims from opponents that they are pursuing a big Australia policy and saying that rather it's just an expected rebalancing of our population after the pandemic. And this, of course, comes amid Anthony Albanese's ongoing gridlock with the Greens over housing policy. Now, joining me to discuss this is economist Warren Hogan. Warren, thanks so much for coming on Paul Murray Live tonight. Got to ask you, I get that we need migration. I'm a migrant myself. But as an economist, do you sometimes feel like when we talk about migration, there are some people who want to act like the normal rules of supply and demand don't apply, and that if we bring in more people, more than we were bringing in before the pandemic, well, that's going to drive up the competition for housing and a lot of other resources, won't it?
Well, that's exactly right. Thanks for having me on the show, James. I think this report today is important, and it highlights, I think, the real problem here is not so much our immigration programs that we've had and that we expect to have in the future. It's this surge in immigration we've got going on right now. And I think the real risk here is that we get some adverse consequences into the economy. We're seeing that right now in housing with rents going up at very rapid rates. This could get worse before it gets better. It could have inflationary consequences. And of course, what this could do is undermine the broader support in the community for immigration long term. So the BCA is trying to disconnect the two. The problem is that there is no doubt that immigration and the pace of immigration right now is playing a role in our economy. They can't run away from that fact.
Yeah, and I mean, you said something I think that was very important right there about inflation, and it feels to me like on the one hand, the Reserve Bank is trying to, slow the economy with interest rates and so on, and that's all fair and, classical economics right there. But at the same time, the government is saying, well, it doesn't matter that we're going to have more competition, at least for the next 3 to 5 years for housing until more housing can get built, and that's a big component of inflation. And underlying this, of course, Warren, is the problem we have with productivity. Until we get something done about that, it's going to be a huge mess, won't it?
Yeah, and that's why I described the government's decision to really up the immigration program in the budget for this current year and last year to be quite a risky policy. And that's because they're bringing in a lot of people into an economy that is overheating and needs to slow down. And of course, these people will help with labour shortages and may even take some pressure off wages, which will help with inflation over the medium term. But of course, it's no silver bullet. It's going to bring with it demand. And we're seeing that obviously in those rental markets for housing. But it's demand more generally across the economy, running in complete contrast to the RBA's objectives of slowing demand to help relieve broader inflation pressures. So I think the government has potentially misjudged this. We could have run the higher immigration rate at a more gradual pace. I mean, the previous government's decision at the end of 2021 was just to go back to the previous intake, not to play catch up for the population loss during the pandemic. But the new government has decided to play catch up in a period of 2 years. And I think that's where the risk lies. And I worry, as someone who wants to see immigration supported over the medium to long term, that the pressures that this brings to bear on the economy now will see that support in the community start to dwindle.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask next about, the social fabric, because it feels to me like there's going to be a lot of people out there in the community who think, well, the big end of town, to use a phrase, the BCA, the business lobby, they want a big immigration program for all the reasons you just mentioned, because, drives down wages, creates larger markets. Again, you don't necessarily need to deal with productivity if you have this happening to create a larger GDP, even if GDP itself isn't going up. Doesn't this create an opportunity then for the Liberal Party to come in and say, we actually think they need to throttle that back?
Well, I think that was certainly the instincts of Dutton and Morrison when, the feedback they were getting at the time at the end of the pandemic was that Australians broadly want to see migration rebooted, but not maybe at the same pace and certainly not a catch-up. But of course, this takes leadership, and Australians have always been a little bit wary of it, as many countries are. In fact, many countries absolutely have no migration programs. But of course, this is why it must be managed. And you can see the political benefit that the government can identify from running high migration. One is to take pressure off wages, and the other one is to reduce the chances of a technical recession as the economy slows. So I think they look to those benefits, but I think overlook the potential costs and downside risks. And of course, productivity is really the main game here. And it's not clear that surging our immigration rate over a period of 1 or 2 years is going to do anything for productivity over the medium to long term.